Hello again. I hope that you all have been inspired, that you've gotten some great information, and that the conversations are clearly continuing, which is very exciting. Hey, and we are trending in Houston, so it's very exciting. When I was charged to come together with a convening about arts leadership, Paul Bonin Rodriguez was one of the first people that came to my mind. Paul and I have worked together over the years when I was at DiverseWorks as we co-commissioned his projects. We worked together and with him as a performer. We also worked together as part of the National Performance Network, and we were on the board. Part of the joys of working with Paul is that he brings such incredible humor, insight, and compassion. And he, as an artist, as a dancer, as a performer, as a researcher, scholar, activist, entrepreneur, administrator, marketer, Paul embodies the ideas of artists and leaders. I am thrilled that he is at UT and working with us as part of our advisory board. And I look forward to the words of wisdom and that he will impart with us, and also look forward to him giving us a charge to think about how we work with artists and how what about equitable partnerships. Paul Bonin Rodriguez.
Wow, Sixto, that was great. I had second thoughts about telling my mom not to come. That was amazing. So thank you to the Center for Creative Leadership for inviting me, for the team that put this together, to Sixto. I also do want to apologize to anyone I offended when I cut ahead in line and got a brownie. I recently gave up coffee. It wasn't a religious thing. It was just time. And sugar is the only thing I have to get me through the diurnal dip. And so you saved me at that moment. So please forgive me. So broadly, this talk approaches the terms on which artists might contribute as leaders in Houston's creative future. I've spent much of the last decade deciphering how policy and planning might more readily be the province of artists, who will then contribute knowingly and avidly to building creative cities, right alongside the philanthropists, urban planners, academics, and arts administrators who regularly populate meetings like this. My forthcoming book, I've got to plug it, Performing Policy, contributes to that work by assessing how arts and culture policy research and development since the culture wars have defined artist practices very differently than past generations. My method of research and analysis relies on performance and performance studies to animate findings of researchers like Maria Rosario Jackson and Ann Markison, who have done much to support the work of artists. When reading and reviewing empirical analysis, historical documents on arts funding, I'm generally paying close attention to the scenarios like this one, where artists and arts organizers, it's a broad category, right, come together fully passionate and embodied to plan their future. Given my own background as a writer-performer, I sometimes find it more salient to, in the words of one program officer, lead with the art. So let me begin with a testimony to propose the terms on which artists might function as leaders. I wrote a show. The year was 1992. I had been living in San Antonio for all of 3 years at that point, having come there from Denver, where I had danced at Colorado Ballet, and then worked in an art gallery. I had begun to see the work of queer performers like Tim Miller and Holly Hughes, Luis Alfaro, Peggy Shaw, Marga Gomez, Beto Araiza, Carmelita Tropicana. I was just really taken by their political savvy and their AIDS activism, their comic skills, their provocative ideas and tales of queer survival and joy. But I was also challenged by the fact that they depicted queer as an urban trope, something that happened in New York, Los Angeles, or San Francisco. I saw no rural representation, and I wondered what it would be like to be queer in small-town Texas, as I had been. to be healed from what had been a violent experience as I needed to be, and also to find joy while still there, which I desperately wanted to believe was possible. I wanted to rewrite my past. What would it be like to recast my history in a supportive community of a theater space, especially at a time when a very conservative Christian culture war was reminding me daily on the national stage my homespun experiences of being outcast? So I wrote a show called Talk of the Town and shared it with another performer. He said, "Put it on stage," and I did. The process from page to stage took a few months. The show begat other opportunities, and with the performer's support, I began to get bookings. I want to interject for a minute to say that our collegial relationship took a hit some months later. And at our first and only double-billed performance for a fundraiser for AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, we were in Houston performing at Diverse Works. I got more applause. The deck was stacked in my favor. I am actually a Houston native. My show was about all things Texas, the small town of Glen Rose, where I grew up after my family moved from Bel Air. My description of the show was something like Johnny, irrepressible small-town sissy boy and fast food worker, finds love, lust, and Lady Bird Johnson at the local Dairy Queen. Now, I drove in from Austin yesterday, and this year's the wildflowers are especially beautiful, so I feel compelled to point out that my character's love and lust were not directed at our esteemed former First Lady. But when that esteemed former First Lady and liberal icon shows up at the Dairy Queen and orders a hamburger with mayonnaise, in which, in Texas parlance, that's actually called a sissy burger. I don't know if you know that. She does help our protagonist see things anew. My tales of Southern Baptist, of charming and unself-conscious drive-through customers, and naked runs in the sprinklers of a football field were Texas-based stand-ins for the freedom of expression arguments on the national stage. Also, at the heart of them was my own desire to feel at home in my skin, in my town, in a state of mind called Texas. My first show stayed on the road for a decade, during which I never stopped working. I wrote other plays and solo shows and created dance pieces too. Somewhere, you see, between being a dancer and being a writer-performer, I had also, for a very short time, been a writer-producer for a television documentary series about U.S. Latinos called Heritage, Herencia. There I learned to edit, to write press releases and title segments, but also how to efficiently guide a production crew so that none of the limited resources were wasted. This was public TV. And so that the camera person and sound person recorded everything exactly as I needed. All these skills were critical to my showmaking. The success of my first solo theater piece was a really great thing. It was also just a really terrible thing. It was a mixed bag. I feared my success was more serendipitous than the product of hard work. It seemed to have happened too fast. Having to top oneself very quickly, which I had to do within a year, can be harrowing. But the chance to make a living doing something so fun and engaging was exciting. Already I was abstracting my labor and my expertise, downplaying my accomplishments, trying to stay humble, when in truth I needed to assume a bit of status as an artist and keep faith. I did not think about process and time very well, but assumed it was my job to make my work in private and then bring it to show an audience. Some of this assumption was ingrained in me by the timeless time of ballet training, where one works for hours in the studio, endlessly rehearsing and assuming that he is never quite good enough, never quite thin enough, or never quite fully ready. So see, that brownie was actually my liberation. Another part of the abstraction came from the fact that, like many artists, I cobbled together a living from disparate jobs to support my creative habit. There wasn't much time to imagine what a systematic approach would be. Such is the patchwork nature and consequence of the artist economy. Working in private as a writer-performer meant not only writing the show, but writing the press releases, getting the posters designed, printed, and distributed, hiring the lighting designer, costume designer, and director, and securing the space, writing personal letters and making phone calls to all those who would come, hiring a camera crew, editing the videos, making labels, affixing them, not to mention sending out press packets and proposals to the spaces across the nation where, over time, I established a deep network of relationships. Thanks to the performer who brought me into the field and who has really remained just a great ally. In my first year, I did perform in San Francisco, New York, and Los Angeles. And within the first 18 months, I was touring regularly, going from box office splits and self-subsidized housing and travel, aka cheap flights and sleeping on sofas, to guaranteed fees and paid expenses. Writing serial shows meant that my first years had the opportunity to build momentum. Within a very short time, I managed to make a living as an artist from my home in San Antonio. I was an anomaly. As Ann Markuson notes, many artists in the 1990s were fully relocating to New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, places where I was regularly touring. I managed to get funnier and even darker in my humor. I relied heavily on good titles. The second solo show, The Bible Belt and Other Accessories, was also a success, as was the third, Love in the Time of College. Owning up to my urban existence, I did soon leave the Dairy Queen in the small town far behind. In subsequent shows like Memory's Caretaker, Quinceañera, Simplicity, and Catherine's Joint, I wrote about race, mental health, sexual boundaries, class, culture, belonging, the legacy of Vietnam, juke joints, and AIDS. Only some of those were solo shows, several were collaborations, and about half did not. The bulk of my touring was between 1992 and 2001, which for the arts was a period of relative stability and growth, sandwiched between two recessions. Now, it's important to note that I came to my craft and those, quote, early successes through a dense and important network of relationships during the culture wars. And because of that, I saw my career through a lens that looked something like the glasses one gets at a 3D movie. The tint of one lens was colored by opportunity. The other was obligation. My job, as I understood it, was never just about me. My job was about the people implicated by my process, the spaces who presented me, the staff who worked there, the crew that supported me, their own network of relationships and their obligations to core audiences, to funders, to press, and to their own families. Some of these networks were local. I was fortunate to have a home space in Jumpstart Performance Company, a highly diverse community-based theater company committed to original performance. Jumpstart was the first space that allowed me to create the show, to publicize it, and to take home a portion of box office proceeds. During the 18 years I was a part of that company, from 1992 to 2010, Jumpstart's budget grew from less than $100,000 to well over $1 million. Jumpstart relied heavily on its core constituency of artists to do the work. So my skills in audience gathering, writing good titles, which like New Moves, Wednesdays in Performance, Works in Progress, were often required to name performance series or a whole capital campaign, Jumpstart, Local Address, National Treasure. It was only a matter of time before I was writing a copy for grants and writing and direct funding for the organization as well as myself, and later working alongside the development director who churned out grants based on boilerplate material that I had written before. For a time, I even served as interim managing director, which easily translated from my past as a writer-performer. I also saw myself as responsible or obligated to the arts infrastructure of San Antonio and to the nation. I experienced the culture wars of the 1990s very much as a local phenomenon. In San Antonio, a city council member who ran on a conservative platform sought to redirect arts funding from hotel occupancy taxes to the well-endowed San Antonio Sports Foundation. The move ultimately contributed to a series of arts cuts and the downgrading of the city's much beleaguered Department of Arts and Cultural Affairs. The city agency negotiating between the conservative city council member and a number of more progressive artist organizations. Although the bulk of the funding went to the majors, the small amount given the small and mid-sized organizations was critical to our survival. Like many, I joined the protest, signed up to speak at City Hall, polished my rhetorical skills, and generally grew deflated that the folks sitting on the dais, including Councilman Sports, were not paying attention. Now, I have a footnote here because this is actually taken from my book, and the funny thing is I've been doing research on that moment, and what was really happening was newspaper accounts was indicating that this man also had an extramarital affair and had to announce a child at that time. So typical of a culture wars agenda, he was doing a very political act and showing, was up to his sort of conservative cred. So it was a very complicated, dicey, even dramatic time. The city's moves against arts funding also led to the defunding of the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center in 1998, and in 2001 for its support of a lesbian gay film festival. Their subsequent lawsuit, the Esperanza Center versus the City of San Antonio, was the first test case for the National Endowments for the Arts versus Findley et al., the case that capped off the culture wars. In the landmark ruling, District Judge Judge Orlando Garcia argued that the center had been unjustly targeted for its association with historically marginalized groups, women, people of color, and queers. Suffice it to say that in my South Texas city, as in my small town youth, as in the Dairy Queen kitchen on stage, I felt at center of our nation's cultural divide. Nationally, I also saw myself obligated to those who booked me, to the arts presenters who had become colleagues, whose life stories, work, and health crises I knew very well. My job was to produce a great show, but also the copy and the photos that would bring in audiences. My job was to fundraise and to secure contracts to pay all those who worked with me. My job was to reach out to those individuals and journalists I had met while traveling and shill my show by passing out flyers late at night on the streets of whatever city I was in, to give a good workshop, to stay for the post-show discussion, to write a thank you or a testimony for a grant, even to read a grant in process and to make a donation, or rather, capital reinvestment in my field. When the city's Office of Cultural Affairs, the TCA, or the NEA asked me to serve on panels, I willingly obliged. When the NEA or any other granting organization would ask me to read grants, study the budgets, I would study the budgets and read the grants to the best of my ability and participate in the policy discussions that always happened at the end of each. When asked to serve on boards with local and national organizations, I said yes to ensure the future of my artistic homes and hideaways. A writer friend of mine told me at one point she realized that to get her work done, she had to eschew all boards and panels. I thought, well, that may work for a writer, but for a community-based writer, performer, artist, citizen, it just won't do. Sitting with arts administrators and policy scholars, I noticed a gap between our respective approaches and concerns. The artists I knew tended to focus on more immediate questions like a next gig or a new show in plain and simple language. Arts organizers and policy experts deployed a common vernacular to explain phenomena in the arts sector. Phrases like mission creep, founder syndrome, and capacity building encapsulated complex dynamics in some cases, untested hypotheses in others. At the same time, the language used by my administrative colleagues also revealed that they had codified certain practices and assumptions and learned to render them in shorthand to turn their attention to long-term strategizing, which was tied to some aspect of their organizational funding. I really had not yet begun to think systematically about how I might plan to sustain my work over the long term. My funding, you see, came from one-off tours and project grants. More than once, I fell deeply into debt and jumped out of it thanks to some grand, lucrative, even wild, crazy art gesture. My body and spirit were getting tired, and I was nowhere near planning my future. Sometimes I thought that my work in San Antonio should be free because I knew the struggle we all went through together. And then sometimes I thought it should be well paid. In negotiating contracts, I could act with magnanimity. I can never say that word, so you know it. Or toss out a series of microaggressions, concerned that if I gave up a bit of ground, I was showing I was weak. I had no material standing or sure footing. It wasn't that I didn't think about the money. I just didn't know how I should think about money and support for me. Depending upon the organization of the booker, the price went up or down. In negotiating my contracts, I often imagined myself as part of a spate of performers. A low figure for me could make it harder for others. Yet when I arrived at the spaces, I often found them taxed and facing deficits. Their administrators doing the work for love in the absence of money, and I was reminded that the arts economy was a mystery to others as much as me. It took a long time for me to realize that a performer's demands, when combined with a track record and adequate material, planning, and time, offers to organizations and spaces the means and the argument to fundraise and grow. Such are the upward demand dynamics of nonprofit fundraising. Now, did I see my board service as building up critical skills or just as a demanding obligation? Did I think of myself as a policy expert or an individual building up grassroots policies? Well, I was more comfortable thinking about audiences with respect to the space than with the organization building. I was more comfortable with the lights going to half and then dark, and then coming up with a slow 1, 2, 3, and launching into a monologue or a scene, then assuming a leadership role. Wednesdays is Christian steak finger basket special night at Dairy Queen for $2.59 and believing in the Lord. It would take a long time and a lot of study to realize that what we're calling the creative sector was actually remarkably avowed and supportive, and to really fully see the extent and commitment on the part of all of its players. And to shift my lens from obligation, a word that implies a debt, to partnership, a word that implies exchange and mutual support. Now let me reiterate. My sense is that with respect to artists, how we are proposing a future on the part of the nonprofit sector, but also the whole creative sector, locally follows on these two principles, opportunity and partnership, and that the combination of these two principles makes the biggest intervention. How are opportunities evident, and what are the terms of partnership? Now, much of what I've just said or told echoes the findings of numerous studies published over the last 2 decades, though mostly in the last few years. It's very easy to lay my story over like prominent themes and patterns in What Artists Say, a 2013 report from the McKnight Foundation. Most artists function within a complex and multifaceted system. I accessed diverse networks to make my work. I relied heavily on peers and artist service organizations. Artists need encouragement of all sorts. Mine came not only from the approbation of the audiences and communities, the support of a company, but oddly from the us versus them mentality of a culture wars era. Fellow artists are a critical part of the ecosystem. I got more than a leg up at the beginning. Many of my later works were collaborations, and I belong to an artist-driven company. Some arts organizations are essential creative and career development partners. Yes, indeed. Families are a crucial foundation. I did have the support of family. My capacities can also be attributed to growing up middle class, having access to education and an arts education. I want to bookmark that point and come back to it. But it's also easy to add one more element to the mix. The skills required to make art available requires all forms of organizing. Artists have much to give back. So here are the points that I want to add. First of all, when we talk about the culture wars era, and we do so obliquely when we talk about new forms like creative placemaking, we're talking about a transitional period from the Ford era and the leverage grant to the idea of really being infused in communities, okay? When we speak about the individualized artist grants and the leverage grant model that had been in use for nearly 4 decades by that time, we often use the term individual artist. And that term easily signals that artists work independent of institutions. Now, Ann Markison and Ann Johnson note that artist centers are places where artists learn skills and rehearse competencies and intersect with peers. My story reflects that. While I saw myself as an independent artist and applied to grants for individual artists, I was often in crises about my role in community, especially my arts community. So let me label this the problem of the term individual artist. In my own book, I often use a term like artist producer to signal both the status that artists have and the roles they play when co-producing with other institutions. And that's based on researching sort of the dynamics of the culture wars era. Second, my intersection with artist centers, but also with grants, served an epistemological function. They basically taught me how to organize my work. I was taught to think in terms of fiscal years. My calendar was shaped really on an 18-month cycle. I might propose in one fiscal year, but the actual work and the check would not come to fruition until sometime in the next fiscal year. But I also learned the elements required of me to successfully produce any one work. I was constantly rehearsing my skills at the next meeting. In Investing Creativity, 2003, space is depicted as a type of material support, but the report also allows me to think of space in terms of training and professional development, validation, and demands and networks. Through my work with artist centers, I experienced the arts as a place of great support, but also a site that requires much of me. However, not being labeled a staff member or an administrator for some reason, my status as a producer along with those centers wasn't always legible to me. So my rewards came with tension. I want to label this the problem of needing clarity about the relationship between the artist and arts infrastructure. I was often negotiating not only my role, but also my status and my worth, and needing clear terms on how I could do that. My third point may come from the moment I was coming up as an artist, but I also think it's a product of artist awards or grants. The educator Alfie Kohn argues that an award is a reward that has been made artificially scarce. The research in Investing in Creativity points to artist ambivalence to grants as having regional biases or taking too much time or being competitive, or although even more recent studies like McKnight's point the value of that artists actually place on getting grants and the sort of, the way they give us social and cultural capital. And programs like Creative Capital have done much to amplify and multiply the benefits of competitive awards. Now, at their best, grants and awards are first and foremost epistemic. They challenge an artist to organize her ideas around her work. On the bad side, they can signal a problem of scarcity rather than abundance. And indeed, it seems that the premise of the Houston Indicator report that I recently read is to organize around the idea of growth and abundance. So we may actually be talking today about some long-term contracts rather than short-term awards and long-term prospects for abundance and growth. Now, I see all three of these problems as critical to artist contracts in the creative placemaking efforts, but especially to Houston's desire to grow its creative community. I'm using the term contract because I want to explicitly signal that we are negotiating the terms of a relationship between organizational entities or initiatives and artists and creatives who function not as individuals, but through their practiced role in communities. Rehearsal and performance. How might artists join city agencies or be named as stakeholders in public-private partnerships of redevelopment or public art efforts? How would these contracts not only balance out, but also make excellent use of the unique skills of all vested parties? How will all parties share and exchange languages and skills? How might artists and organizers negotiate openly with respect and needs? How might we erase the arts organizers status divides? How might artists become fully vested partners to the whole process? How might artists staff initiatives for the long term? And how might the growth of the artist population reflect a multi-year investment in skills and status rehearsal and performance? How might this long-term commitment to professional rehearsal and performance take into account what Roberto Bedoya refers to as the local variables of place and culture in his recent report on the Tucson Pima Arts Council? I'm asking because we also have to think, how do we work across communities that are unlike my own, who were not educated in a college arts program? And how do all those exchanges and language skills and moments of listening and validation work across the different understandings so that we all come up? Now, twice in the last 6 months, I've attended meetings dedicated to urban development and creative placemaking, in which the talkback was stopped by an artist or artist who asked how urban development efforts might actually translate to some real work and money. In one, an artist just asked, "Where can I find an affordable space for my theater company? Huh?" In another, an artist shared a bit of frustration at not finding placemaking or other sustaining opportunities as accessible or legible in her home community of New Orleans. "I made a lot of sacrifices to do this work," she said, before asking how she might see a return on her investment. Now, the comment coming from that artist surprised me. Just before the session, she had told me she was leaving the South to take a position with a prestigious community-based theater company in Los Angeles. I thought her happy. But clearly, her decision to go reflected both a push away from home and a pull to a creative supercity, and it was a move that was marked by ambivalence. The artist was echoing a finding in your own executive summary of the Indicators report. Houston is a great city to get started or to be at the top, but without any clear path from the bottom to the top, people will move on. Now, I'm not telling these stories to call out artists. Seriously, I'm not even keeping up with this. Paul Bonner, okay. Or to preempt anyone who has to stand up and say, "What about me?" Because I think those are like some of the most important moments. I think those scenarios provide important interventions. I want to assert that the fault or the rupture is not the part of the planners or hosting organizations. The data presented in these meetings is very smart and forward-thinking. The accomplishments are inspiring. The goals set by our cultural organizations are very clear. But I am also going to say that we often keep a perceived gap between artists and organizers. Thinking that is organized around historical notions of scarcity, which the policy sector has long been seeking to overturn. In How Cities Can Nurture Cultural Entrepreneurs, a policy brief for the Kauffman Foundation in 2013, Ann Markison lays out 7 excellent strategies. First of all, of course, know who your artists are. 2, encourage convening and equipment sharing artist centers, because we get a lot done when we all get together and meet. And sometimes a lot done is just getting to know each other. Okay? Develop sustainable artist studio and live work buildings, because we have a lot to provide and offer to our neighborhoods and communities. Provide entrepreneurial training tailored to artists and designers, because some of these proposals are new. Embed artist in city development strategies, because we have a role to play in staff and in long-term projects. Partner with local arts and policy faculty for entrepreneurial research and training. This can always be a mutual learning project. Recognize the significant role of grants for artists, which I would like to extend to long-term contracts. That's just me. Okay. One of the documents that I keep returning to in my research is The Arts and the Public Purpose, 1997, the findings from the 92nd American Assembly. I turn to this report because it offers a clear picture of all that was known about the arts in 1997, all that was concerned about during the culture wars, and all that was hoped for today. The meeting's initial findings even echo my own experiences. The greater arts sector is poorly understood. The commercial sector is susceptible to market fluctuations. Nonprofits are overtaxed and underfunded and not able to support artists as well as their own bottom line. At the end of the food chain, artists are at risk unless they can provide additional assistance economically, politically, and socially. The report also offers some engaging rhetoric and poetry. The problem statement beginning the report offers a rhetorical turn. Now, typically the arts and arts issues have been discussed in terms of needs of the arts and artist. In contrast, this assembly presents findings based on very different assumptions that the arts can and do meet the needs of our citizens. The preamble section of the report even adheres closely to Jefferson's first lines in the Declaration of Independence, substituting the arts for the bodies of constituents. Jefferson begins with "we the people." The 92nd American Assembly report begins with "we have come together to examine what public purposes are served and ought to be served by the arts in America in all their grand variety." The whole report, final report, argues passionately for freedom of expression and the value of the arts, but it does so by turning the rhetoric from what arts have done wrong to what they can uniquely offer communities. Among the convening's final recommendations is this idea. A pool of artists should be identified to provide creative leadership and to continuing efforts resulting from this assembly. Now, I'm going to amplify that comment and say, with respect to urban development and creative placemaking, and with respect to Houston's demographics and density, its history and its promise, that pool can be very great indeed. Thank you. Yes.
So Paula is willing to take questions if anybody has.
Yo, you want this talk? Sure. I have to do the. Will you help me look at the typos? There are a few thousand in there. I'm so embarrassed. I have a hard time with typos. Sure. I'm happy to share it. Yeah.
It'll be on our site. Come back to my site. Other questions?
Hello.
Hi.
I'm a student. My name is Cecilia.
Hi.
I have a question. You talked a lot about your work during the culture wars of the 90s, and I'm wondering what you think the relationship between art and culture is now, and what term you might use to define how we relate art and culture, because I think we're not living in a culture war, but I'm kind of interested. Like, growing up in the 90s, I've only existed in a multicultural paradigm in relation to the arts, so
Sure.
I'm interested in knowing how it's shifted.
Okay. Yeah, my use of the term is really interesting. What we call the culture wars of the 1990s had to do with the fact that artists were identified. Artists actually became the tokens by which we argued the culture wars of the era. Now, there is significant arguments, and it's regularly published. The culture wars exist today. Okay, it's gay marriage. It's immigration. What else is in the culture wars? We're kind of grouping this again. It's ongoing. Huh? Yeah. So we're still in it, right? At that time, artists were identified. And that led to the defunding of the NEA in 1994-95, the end of individual artist grants. What had been, at that point, nearly 30 years of development and intervention, oftentimes led by artists, in creating an individual artist program. So artists were supported directly. I think the promise at this point is that we move the rhetoric away from the grant model, the scarcity model, although we have grants, but we use them now to motivate, to amplify, to partner with other projects. We've moved from that to this idea of, okay, we're going to build our community. We are going to work in neighborhoods specifically. And the challenge of the artist now is to actually understand how the community functions. Who's funding what? Can I go right to my city council member? Can I go to the mayor and just say, and you can make an appointment with the mayor, and say, I'm doing this huge art project. Let me sell it to you. I mean, get Hollywood for a second and just go there and ask, and use every no as a chance to rehearse another yes. And I guess I get that from fundraising. No, okay, well, thank you so much. We'll ask again. The one time I didn't ask somebody for money, I want to tell you this. I didn't ask somebody for money, and I got a letter that they were offended. No, seriously. And he said, don't you know, I'd give you any amount that you want for your show because it means so much to me. And this is so funny, because I was an artist, right? So I thought I was begging. And he said, and there are two things I should tell you about this. First of all, he said, this is a place where I come and I sort of get to live or think differently, and it means a lot to me. Your work helps me see the world differently. And I thought, oh my gosh, my work plays an important part in somebody else's life. The second thing I learned was he made a lot more money than I ever imagined. I as an artist, kept imagining everybody had the same income as me. And then, recently we were at dinner and he said, I had to write a check for $200,000 to the IRS last year because of my income. It was just terrible. And I was scared to ask him for $287.50. I was like, oh my God, I'm so stupid. So and I always asked for odd numbers. I never asked for 50. I'd always ask for $384.21, just to make the check writing harder and funnier and make them shake their head at me. I'm annoying, So I hope I answered your question. I think the thing now is to know your community, know how it works, be bold, and go shake hands. And talk long term if you're going to do it. But think about what you're doing too, about, every other thing you're doing at that time.
I need to turn, okay. I feel like the anecdote you just told maybe also answered her question, which is that one of the main things about being an artist right now is doing it in relationship to an increasingly widening income gap. And so if you are folks who amplify voices or, make visible people's expression, that's really, really important, especially when fewer people are listening and more people don't have the platform for that. So that's how I would define it as an artist working now.
And I think there are also opportunities to do projects where it's going to reach communities that, not everything should be a high-dollar project, especially if you want to work in community. But that does not stop you from packaging it and taking it for support. And if you don't get it the first time, at least get some attention, get some blogging, get some whatever, and send a nice note to the person who turned you down and said, I just want you to know this happened. We're still working at it. We're passionate at it. And, we want you to come someday.
Hello. I keep thinking about this island of creative placemaking. Mm-hmm. Is it a place we arrive, or is it always a work in progress? And as somebody who's kind of worked in the arts for a while, to me it's the process that's so interesting, and sort of like reading the news. I read the news, whether I like it or not, it's important for me to read the news. But I remember something that the former director of the Museum of Fine Arts used to say, that the enemy is apathy. And sometimes I get apathetic because I don't understand the process. It is no longer accessible. So I guess there are two questions in this. How do we develop an audience that cares about the process and watching that happen? And then we're always trying to make place. We're always trying to live in a place. When does it become more creative than not creative? And in Houston, the city's never going to invest in creative placemaking. What does the city know about creative placemaking? Do you all know any creative placemaking in Houston that we're not doing as individuals? So yeah. I don't really know what this place we arrive at, that we have created a place that's a place. Okay, was that nonsense?
No. I'm trying to make sure I caught up because there were several things in there, Emily, that I'm thinking about. Well, that's the point. I don't think we do. I think the fact that I can look back and reflect on it now and sort of do a litany of all the stuff I was doing and show you that it was really this manic occupation is hindsight. I'll own up to that. And my reason for testifying in hindsight is to point out to anybody coming up, this is all you'll be doing, so start putting a price on it. Okay, so that's my first thing. My second is that my growth, and I did collapse bookings and tourings and contract negotiations. I collapsed a lot of really tense meetings and learning moments and things where I thought, oh my God, I negotiated that. They hate me so much. They will never book me again, blah, blah, blah. And they weren't thinking that. I did that all the time. So I was always in this scarcity mode, right? Okay? Because we had been preaching scarcity a long time. Okay? Now, I want to say, there is the scarcity that we preach regularly for the arts, and then there's real need. Okay? And sort of the rubric we keep bringing in the arts is if there's real need and we want to do a project in that community, we will find people who want to join and gather around it. Okay? We're going to counter scarcity for a second and say we can respond to need. That's part of our placemaking effort. Okay? But here's the thing that happens. And I've noticed it. I've been doing a case study on a group of Austin theater artists who did a strategic plan with the support of a foundation. And I'm fascinated by what they did. In 2 years' time, with a budget of less than $90,000, they essentially replicated a national study based solely on observation, data gathering from each other, et cetera, and planned for a big future. Package it up, send it off to the foundation for $687,000 to do the work. And the first thing is, that study, which they replicated, had cost $3 million. So, they had done this amazing job. If you read what they came up with, without citing, without looking at anything, and lay it over a national study that cost $3 million, they did the same thing. Second thing is, the proposal they made for $687,000 was done for, I don't know, $60 million by an initiative when all the dollars were spent and everything. So they were way off on the budget, right? And there's been this hopelessness and this moment of coming together where we're all a community now, has to come in, they're ahead of me. But if I look at the data and I look at the fact I can't get a ticket now, or I look at some of the plays that have come out of that period, and I look at the fact that one company finally did her first capital campaign, and she said to me she's going to try. She needed $50,000. She didn't think she could raise it, and I think you were probably part of it, But she called all of us, and I said, and I went into her office one night, and I said, look, I've been sick lately, but I had a feeling I need to be here. I said, what are you doing? And she said, I'm writing a thing. We're going to go for $15,000. I said, you said the thing cost $50. And she said, okay. I said, go for $25. I said, we had already done a letter and raised 10. And I said, you've already raised 10. And we did that before Christmas. We did into your tax letter about this. I said, and so you've already raised 10. Go for another 25. If you are 10 short, you can pay in your 10, and we'll call it a lesson. And in my mind, right? Okay. Now, in her mind, if I'm going to go into her body, right, I know what she's thinking. That would be a loss. I failed. In my mind, that would have been a lesson and a way to go next time. I'm going to make sure that money happens. 9 days before the money's due, she calls me up. We're $18,000 short. I said, great. We can do it. I love that. I like to ask for money. So I said, I'll ask for $1,000 today from somebody, and I'll give you another $250. I'd given $250 at that point. I have a job now, so I write my, I pay for artists. I do what my friend did. So I think I raised, I said, and get so-and-so to raise another $1,000 by calling their friends. So-and-so. They beat the deadline. $2,000 a day for the 9 days. They raised $25,000. The total is $35,000. She had, highballed the best lighting system that she wanted in the world because her design package was so important, was 50. She was willing to go with 25. At 35, she was able to go to the middle, get what she kind of really wanted ambitiously, but also to see that she could do it. And that was not something she had done. She had supported her theater company through a for-profit entity, a bar in her space, up to that point. So, and of course, city cultural contracts for operational expenses. So I think the lessons are always in the doing. Hindsight, of course, offers us things, and what is a failure today is tomorrow's thing. And I think my biggest charge is to push people to start asking for more. When I hear an organization sit on the dais and talk, and we speak from a goal place, I am seeing people who are programmed to always ask for more. Okay? More support, they put arguments together with packages. When I meet with artists, I feel like I'm always having to push them to ask for more. And it was a long time, people always said that to me. You can ask for more. You just need an argument. Oh, I can't do that. I'm sure somebody else is better and more deserving. No, that's what I was thinking. I'm sure someone else is more deserving. No, ask for more. It helps others. The idea that we compete with each other and then it's zero sum, I'm not buying it. I'm not buying it. If we really contribute to abundance, we just have to get our arguments around.
Well, I think that one of the questions for me is, as an artist, you spoke a little bit about this, but you learned tasks that are not about creating work, or creative work. And was that, can you speak a little bit more about not only with that responsibility of it, who else helped you with that aspect, and how can others actually be dealing with these tasks that are well beyond these idealistic performance?
Right. So I had been a dancer, right, and I'd been classical ballet, which is very, hierarchical, and you don't think a lot. You think about your aesthetics, and it's beautiful. It's a wonderful thing. And then I talked briefly that I had been this like documentary producer, right? And there I learned this skill, right? How to take 8 hours of tape and get 8 crucial minutes, okay? How to stay up all night and do that. It wasn't a healthy thing. It just was. I learned that how to keep a crew, how to live on a budget, these sorts of things, and then of course write the press releases. So that was the space where I started learning about that, how to write for myself. So yeah, I had that fortune to be in an occupation, and this may be a way to sort of think about our second occupations, I guess. But I was in an occupation where I had to produce copy about me, just good communications copy. I had to do it in one page because, there were 4 segments in anything, and each segment got 1 page, and I was only one producer of 4 in any one TV show. I was paid terribly. This was a contract gig. It wasn't again, it's not a status thing, but I learned those skills, and then also I did it because I sat with other people to learn it, I guess. I looked for mentors in the station. I wrote, I rewrote, and I want to say that, it's an ongoing process of writing copy about yourself. So that may be what it is. I also learned early on because I had to work with a crew, and one day people didn't show up for my interviews, and I canceled the shoot, and the producer called me in like, we're about to fire you because she said, we're public TV. We don't, if nobody shows up, you go out and shoot the grass and you put it in your next segment so that you can, you know what I mean? So I learned this economy, right? And so I had to start making do. And then I realized, oh my gosh, if I can keep my crew happy, I'll get better footage. And so I started, that was my start to like working with a theater crew and saying, okay, we're going to do this, this, and this. I'm going to get you out of here in 45 minutes, and then we're all going to get a break, or I'm going to get you out in an hour and we're done. Does that answer your question? Those are all sort of disciplinary things located around rehearsal and production, thinking, sort of backtracking, what do I need to get done to support this?
One of the many, many wonderful things you talked about was the networking thing of working with other artists. And I know that you worked with the National Performance Network, which is a really exceptional thing. I don't know if people know about it in here, where people actually worked together in remote places to really build. Could you say a little bit about what you learned from that and what was valuable about that for you?
Yeah. So networks and intermediaries are so important, and that's evident in so many reports. Investing in Creativity names the National Performance Network as one, and it has the Visual Arts Network as well. Diverse Works was part of it, of course, for many years. It's really interesting that the language of National NPN, every year MK Wegman, the CEO and president, starts with, the National Performance Network is a network of spaces, but we are a partnering organization. We create partnerships between centers and artists, is essentially what she's saying. Because it is a network of centers, it is ready-made to locate artists in places. My last commission was a Diverse Works commission. I couldn't have made the show without Diverse Works support. It not only provided critical support, but it codified contracts for me because it gave me a contract to use and to base my work on and to structure my fees on. It gave me a rubric for community engagement because it challenged me to do community engaged practice in addition to my show. It gave me access to other spaces because once you're on the network, you're essentially, the spaces are talking to each other, you get to see each other. It's interesting to see, and this is a personal observation, so every year they have a meeting, right? And they invite to the annual meeting their presenting spaces, philanthropists, local artists, and then all artists who have been presented on the network that year, right? There's always a critical tension when people get there. There's a hunger for bookings. There's a fear I'm not going to get bookings. And always at the beginning of the conference, everyone is reminded, this is not a booking conference. You are not to be booking, right? But the hunger to, you got, time's clicking. You got to make you got to make the money. You got to be seen. You got to show your show. You got to have your elevator conversation ready. No, it's actually the intimate relations that that I just availed myself of a bad metaphor. It's actually the good relationships that happen in the bar at night. It's the talking to somebody in the hallway, the we ought to work together sometime, that you follow up with the note. What network theory calls loose ties. The theory that we actually don't get it from people we know closely as much as the loose ties, and I would say it's even the casual conversation. It's the relaxing a bit, saying I'm an artist, and that's why I keep saying assume status. Saying I'm an artist, feeling good about it, and say I'm doing something really good. I'd like to tell you about it. Can you casually, as opposed to can you book me? That to me has been the value from the perspective of the artist. The network, the relationships, the way it amplifies things. There is one other thing that NPN does, and this is part of their current thinking. And this is really hilarious. It's to counter scarcity. So they have a commissioning fund, $11,000 to an artist to make a show, right? Well, they realized at one point that artists their job was to make tour-ready work that would get on the road, right? But artists were like hitting the stage, and $11,000 wasn't covering it. What they did was $11,000 funded a dream and a lot of promises and a few negotiations for free when the money ran out, right? But what happened was they were getting up to the minute right before production, and the artists were like lacking money and needing to fundraise or having to self-subsidize. And then we're all back to square one. I'm paying to do this work, and nobody's healthy, and the work isn't any better. So they instituted a program called the Fourth Fund because they have 4 programs. And what they did was they took, they'd given you $11,000 to start. It's 11, right? Somewhere on there, okay. Then they give you another $15,000 in resources for a penultimate showing before the premiere in some community where you're going to show it, and it's $5,000 in cash, $5,000 to the space that will present you in cash, and then the space will pony up $5,000 in resources, which may be staff time, it may be rehearsal space, etc. Right? So $15,000 in available resources, and the artist said, "Oh, thank God! I was going to do the lighting design for free. I was going to make the costumes myself. I was going to do something." So we have a whole history of people who have used incentive money to dream, but nobody has any training or capacity to think through what it's really going to cost. And, the assumption is to counter scarcity. It's going to cost that much more. 150% more than we thought is what it's going to cost, So I think those are the benefits of the NPN. It's also staunchly mid-size organization. I mean, it has large organizations, but it is all about mid-size organizations, the intimate centers that are not majors, okay? The places that have professionalized and maybe gotten budgets of $1 million at this point, are really still really closely tied to community and the nonprofit, as well as the nonprofit sector. So,
I think that when we talked about the indicator report that we'll be hearing from tomorrow from the Center for Houston's Future, they talk about this lacking of middle between the small and then the large organizations, and that's essentially what NPN is focused on, has been about this mid-sized organization that engages with artists and communities and partners in ways that are process-oriented, and not all of these organizations are generally ones that work on the margins, not only margins of communities, but margins in terms financially. And I think that it'll be interesting to hear in more detail tomorrow from the Center for Houston's Future about what the implications are, if they have any ideas about that, and then it'll be interesting to hear from you. And many of you here are from that sector. And so how do we actually help strengthen ourselves and work with each other?
well, as part of it's kind of has four prongs of its production. It's four major programs. One of them is cultural policy, and so it's been asserting creative placemaking. Their way of doing it has been the national office is located in New Orleans. Oh.
I do not believe that many of the organizations have figured out how to leverage that understanding and their own their histories, the resources that they have, in order to be able to make those cases. Or they also recognize that at a certain point, those cases require a level of administrative investment and engagement that is beyond what the capacity of the organizations can handle.
I just wanted to amplify something you said. I think when it's mid-sized as well, one of the things that I'm always excited about, too, is when large organizations, what have been called in the past the majors, partner with mid-sized and small organizations as well. To me, I think that is another opportunity for reciprocal learning. And I'm speaking today from artist standpoint. I'm looking from one space. But, I think really the networks, the partnerships that are happening at all levels are really critical at this point. And certainly, I want to say this again, it's always rehearsing. I used to think I'm a bad policy writer, and I ultimately realized it's all performance anyway, that rehearsing the strategies over and over again, asking again, trying, all that again is critical. This is rehearsal and production, over and over.
Any other comments or questions? Thank you again very much, Paul. So the point, and thank you all very much for all of your attention today, your thoughts, your energy. Thank you very much, Paul, for inspiring words and a perspective that is really important to actually hear. What I hope the Center for Arts Leadership can continue to do is make sure that the artist voice continues to be heard as a leader, and that arts organizations and communities are integral in this conversation. When we talk about these ideas about ecosystem, it is really, for me, understanding the artist, the organizer, the intermediary, and the communities, the audiences that they actually work together. And of course, the funders and the patrons who help make some of that happen. I think that we've heard some really interesting truths from our funders and our different community members and audiences. Some of it, I think, has been inspiring. Some of it has been really interesting best practice. I think that we also have been getting some great Twitter feed, but then the flip charts in the back are empty. So I also want you to think, if you all are coming back tomorrow, what are some of the ideas about information that needs to be collected? How would you like to be measured? And what are the skills that we need to be developed? I think that, so I think that this is also a point in which we've reached a lot of information, and it'll be great for you all to hear from you. If you would like to make any comments of what you've heard today, if you'd like to share that publicly, we have other microphones. Anybody? Or if you'd like to just now have those conversations over drinks, that sounds like a good idea as well. Thank you again, and I hope to see you tomorrow. I'm sorry, there are two other things. There is an official reception that we are joining in as the MFA exhibition at the Blaffer Museum, which starts at 6 o'clock. Also, that I believe that the senior studio, painting studio, is doing a pop-up gallery as well. And then if you want to do the opera at 7:30, Cold Sassy Tree, with Carlisle Floyd's Cold Sassy Tree at Moore's Opera House. Thank you. Did I get everything?